A home's significance is often taken for granted. Physically, a home provides security and protection. Its roof and four walls shield inhabitants from potential dangerous outside forces. Symbolically, a home represents belonging. It's a place a person can call their own, where they are free to be themselves, and that, in many ways, embodies their identity. However, as the cost of living increases, fewer and fewer are able to experience the benefits of a home. Sociologist Matthew Desmond indicates that most poor renting families spend over half their income on housing, demonstrating the direct consequences of rising housing costs combined with static and declining incomes. To make matters worse, existing federal housing programs often fall short in bridging this widening gap. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, for instance, helps low-income households, among additional groups, pay for housing. However, like numerous programs intended to aid the poor, its outreach is limited. Lack of government spending has left countless eligible families without proper assistance. Not only do individuals struggle to afford housing, but the programs that are supposedly in place to minimize the burden often fail to provide an adequate safety net. As a result, renting households are increasingly subject to being removed from property in a harmful process known as eviction. So, why, if at all, should we care? Eviction isn't just a characteristic of poverty, it's a driving factor. Its complicated, sticky nature propels households into a state of instability with lasting consequences. Eviction is not an isolated event. On one hand, factors widely associated with poverty can influence eviction. For example, unemployment and therefore a lack of steady income can give rise to eviction. On the other hand, eviction can kickstart a chain reaction of factors that can propel one into further poverty. For example, without a home, individuals are thrust into a complicated cycle of housing insecurity and homelessness. Eviction's complex relationship with poverty is why the process is worth unpacking and understanding. Poverty is sticky in nature. Once an individual or household has fallen below the poverty threshold, it's difficult to climb back out. Furthermore, while caught in its complex web, they're confronted with countless barriers that complicate their ability to break free and escape. This characteristic of poverty is evident in Dorothy Allison's A Question of Class, as multiple interconnected obstacles prevent Allison from disentangling herself from poverty and constructing a better life. For example, Allison's lack of teeth hinders her chances of receiving a promotion at her service shop, where appearance plays a large role. However, paying for dentures required money that Allison did not have, part of the reason why she desired the promotion and associated pay raise in the first place. Also, a barrier contributing to poverty stickiness is the lack of affordable housing and the eviction that follows suit. Financially disadvantaged families already struggle to make ends meet. Throw in rising costs of housing, and households struggle even more so, as they end up putting the majority of their income towards rent alone. However, eviction by itself is sticky in nature. Similar to poverty, once a household has faced eviction, it's difficult to escape the tricky cycle of housing insecurity that pursues. Barriers beyond lack of affordable housing drive what can be a lasting harmful cycle. For example, the failure of existing federal programs to provide struggling households with assistance plays a role in prolonging housing insecurity as well. Initiatives to address the housing crisis are limited in scope, resulting in 2/3 of renting families below the poverty line receiving no housing assistance, according to Desmond. Waiting lists for programs such as the Housing Choice Voucher Program are either too long or close to accepting applicants and therefore fail to help many of the people in need of assistance. Rather than addressing the shortcomings through additional funding, the government remains complacent. As a result, individuals such as Chrysalis Diaz remain stuck. She notes that people who are living in a middle to lower class system, there's no progression. You're stuck in that system. I don't have subsidies, I work, but I feel stuck in the cycle and I can barely make ends meet. Furthermore, evictions aren't simply forgotten. They're made note of on records and serve as an additional barrier in tenants' pursuit of securing a new home. Landlords consider records in their decision to rent out properties and oftentimes refuse to rent to people with past evictions, contributing to long-term housing instability. Overall, poverty and eviction are complexly linked subjects due to their stickiness and ability to propel people into prolonged worse conditions. However, their complicated interlacing is partly why poverty and eviction are worth understanding. In addressing one, it's possible to address the other. If left without intervention, eviction can give rise to prolonged periods without a secure home, triggering a cascade of negative consequences. For example, a person uprooted due to eviction will likely struggle holding their job and could be at risk of extreme poverty if let go. However, beyond financial consequences, eviction and housing instability also pose a serious threat to one's physical and mental health. Housing, as a social determinant of health, directly influences and impacts one's health outcomes. Quality homes serve a valuable purpose physically. In being warm, clean, dry, and ventilated, homes help keep out pests and mold and prevent sicknesses like asthma. Therefore, stripping a person of their quality home could, in turn, be potentially harmful. Eviction can leave people with no choice but to inhabit a home in poor condition or risk being homeless. However, both decisions aren't favorable and can lead to the loss of health benefits associated with a quality home and even additional health complications like obesity. Even so, eviction is just as detrimental, if not more so, to a tenant's mental health. If kicked out of their home, a person faces more than just the physical burden of losing their shelter. Their psychological health is also put under a great deal of stress. Eviction's time frame doesn't always work in a tenant's favor. Oftentimes, a tenant will be removed from a property without any idea as to where they will go. The pressure to quickly construct a plan to gain one's footing, combined with the uncertainty in securing a home post-eviction, can generate anxiety and depression among evicted tenants. In a study exploring the risk of eviction on the mental health outcomes among U.S. adults, researchers Acharya et al. Determined that of the subjects at risk of eviction, 67% recorded feelings of anxiety compared to just 43% of subjects not at risk. In other words, impoverished individuals vulnerable to eviction are disproportionately prone to poor mental health outcomes. Overall, housing as a social determinant of health directly impacts one's physical and mental health. So as eviction and the processes associated barriers block a tenant's ability to locate a quality home, or any home of that matter, their health is in turn put in jeopardy. Health is just one of the numerous lasting consequences linked to eviction, which is all the more reason why the problem should be better understood and addressed. Despite the extent and magnitude of the problem, eviction goes widely unnoticed. Lack of awareness contributes to the sticky, harmful cycle, allowing the inequalities that drive eviction to persist. Perhaps if people were better informed of such inequalities, real progress could be made in terms of addressing the issue. Data collected by Desmond suggests that eviction disproportionately impacts poor Black women. He states that among renters, over 1 in 5 Black women report having been evicted sometime in their adult life. In other words, a group already burdened by poverty is likely to face the additional burden of housing insecurity. Desmond's research not only reinforces the complex relationship between poverty and eviction, it suggests that racial and gendered inequalities further complicate the cycle, for some more so than others. Another demographic in which Desmond explains is eviction-prone is children. He says, if a tenant in eviction court lives with children, her or his odds of receiving an eviction judgment almost triples. Together, the fact that both women and children are at higher risk of eviction suggests the need for catered interventions such as affordable child care for single mothers. Furthermore, there are inequalities within the eviction process that go unnoticed yet perpetuate the cycle. A crucial part of the eviction process is the court hearing, in which a tenant appears in court to defend their case and the judge decides whether or not the eviction is ordered. However, existing barriers put tenants at disadvantages. For one, a majority of tenants struggle to even appear in court due to reasons concerning work, kids, and transportation. A tenant that's a no-show otherwise has no chance to defend themselves, sealing their fate as evictees. Furthermore, even tenants that appear in court can be put at a disadvantage, especially if they lack an attorney. Desmond, in his book titled Evicted, reveals that 90% of landlords are represented by attorneys and 90% of tenants are not. Without an attorney to provide legal assistance, tenants lack the tools to adequately defend themselves in court. As a result, a tenant's fate is once again sealed well before the court hearing. Overall, inequalities such as the racial and gendered inequalities subjecting Black women to higher risk of eviction, as well as the inequalities underlying the eviction process, play a role in promoting housing insecurity, yet aren't nearly discussed enough. Until the problem is brought to light, the inequalities will continue to fester and prolong the cycle of eviction. To conclude, unpacking the characteristics of eviction, its stickiness, barriers, consequences, and inequalities is no easy task. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't, at the very least, try. Eviction is complexly intertwined with poverty, as poverty can contribute to eviction and vice versa. Therefore, better understanding one process could potentially help with better understanding the other, which is of particular importance considering both launch individuals into hard-to-break cycles of prolonged financial and housing insecurity. If we care at all about the quality of life of others, eviction and housing instability as a driver of poverty are worth unpacking. However, a big step in understanding and addressing the problem is public exposure. Despite eviction's prevalence and harmful impact, the process isn't nearly talked about enough. Perhaps if a better initiative was taken to expose the public to the consequences and inequalities perpetuating the cycle, legislative progress and change wouldn't feel so out of reach.